Now, the United Nations Racism Watchdog has condemned the use of excessive force used by police, especially now in the wake of the Ferguson protests. Specifically, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Now, Committee Vice Chair Noureddin Amir, and I may be butchering that name, so I apologize, said that, quote, racial and ethnic discrimination remains a serious and persistent problem in all areas of life, from de facto school segregation, access to health care, and housing. It also says the excessive use of force by law enforcement officials against racial and ethnic minorities is an ongoing issue of concern, and particularly in light of the shooting of Michael Brown. This is not an isolated event and illustrates a bigger problem in the United States, such as racial bias among law enforcement officials, lack of proper implementation of rules and regulations governing the use of force, and the inadequacy of training of law enforcement officials. Now, in total, a panel of 18 independent experts grilled the U.S. delegation on what they refer to as persistent racial discrimination against African Americans and other minorities, including within the criminal justice system. Now, Ambassador Keith Harper told the panel that his nation has made quite, quote, great strides towards eliminating racial discrimination, but conceded that we have much left to do. I couldn't agree more. Now, I want to ask you guys here on the panel if this action from the UN will actually do any good, or will our politicians continue to ignore this issue as often as they do when it comes to anything that the UN presents?
We in the United States have the strongest veto power in the United Nations, so I'm pretty sure that this is going to fall on deaf ears. What I do want to point out is that this is auspicious not just because the UN is identifying racial disparities in the United States, because that's always been. What we're going through now is kind of racial discrimination light, because back in the 60s we had COINTELPRO and the FBI really dismantling forward-moving community organizers within minority communities, be it black, Mexican, Japanese, whatever. And I think what it really identifies and shows is that the U.S. is no longer having the stronghold on morality anymore. The UN feels comfortable enough to put the United States on blast now, which is very, very telling to show how we're kind of waning in our influence as far as public opinion is concerned.
We're no longer that shining city on the hill, as they like to put it.
Well, I mean, first of all, America's veto power is just as strong as any of the other veto power countries. A veto is a veto, no matter what. But and with the UN saying this, it's not. I get a sense that they're just slightly getting a bit on the Ferguson bandwagon, if you want to call it that. I mean, they could have released this report at any time. It just happens that Ferguson has brought to light in a more kind of virulent manner kind of the real racial discrimination that goes on in America. And yes, as the ambassador said to the UN, yes, they've made huge strides in kind of recent decades and stuff, but it's almost like it hasn't become racism in America. It's not as abrupt and in your face as it was previously. It's now kind of swept under the rug. It's more subtle. It's more subconscious, and that subconscious racism, on the Young Turks, they talk about those studies time and time again, kind of African American sounding names, or black hand versus white hand when selling something on eBay. One thing I found interesting was the director of the ACLU kind of towards the end of the article said, when it comes to human rights, the United States must practice at home what it preaches abroad. And whilst I understand that sentiment, obviously kind of America's always saying, we should kind of practice human rights, you always condemn other countries, but kind of what America practices abroad, you have indiscriminate drone strikes, that's not necessarily the best human rights practices when it comes to your foreign policy as well. So I wouldn't necessarily agree kind of saying, look at the good work we do in other countries, because yes, America does a lot of good work in other countries when it comes to human rights and stuff, but it also kills a lot of people in other countries as well, so I'd maybe stay away from that. But yeah, with the UN, I think in these sort of reports, I don't think they really mean a huge amount. Some kind of the people who care about this sort of stuff, they'll read it, but for the vast majority of the people, they won't hear about this report at all. The mainstream media won't cover it because it's simply not a good story, and all the mainstream media companies, they just, oh yes, America #1, so they don't want to kind of diminish America's power or kind of slap its face on the international scene, so no one else is really going to hear about this story, and I don't think that's necessarily a big problem anyway.
I find it interesting that they care so much about discrimination in America, but they never said anything about the Muslim Americans who have gotten spied on by local police departments, or things like that, or addressing France and the laws that they've passed where they're discriminating against Muslim women and prohibiting them from wearing their hijabs and their head garments. I think a lot of this is just, sweet whispers of nothing in people's ears to make, for whatever reason, to grandstand. But there's no Western government that has clean hands. Every government has a group, a minority that they are royally fucking over right now. So I think, at the very least, the United States can take the criticism from the UN and internalize it and maybe try to change. I highly doubt that. That's always, a nice thing to dream about. But I think this echoes on a larger problem that is going across the board that people don't really want to pay attention to.
I do think the kind of, yes, other countries such as France and stuff, they do have some discriminatory practices to other minorities. I think that the case of the kind of bang the hijab in kind of public places, if they're working as a teacher in kind of public buildings and stuff, those laws do have some legitimacy. But I think you're right that it's interesting that the report pretty much solely focused on African Americans in this case, because they did focus on the flashpoint of Ferguson. But there's time and time again kind of Muslim Americans who have been focused all the time, and it happens across the world. And yes, you could pick up on individual flashpoints in any country, but I think that the UN probably wanted to target America because America is the largest voice on the international scene still. You may not have the large amount of power, arguably, but you're still the largest voice. And with Ferguson coming to light, they just want to make a bit of an example of America and say, hey, look, kind of sort your shit out as well before you start slamming other people, which I think is fair enough to target America for those reasons, simply because you are America.
All right, and this is like the one segment I haven't spoken a lot in, but like it's always good to have, like, I think criticism is a positive. Like, the UN isn't like coming from a bad place in this. Like, they want us to fix our problems like within, and like to Steven's point about the ACLU guy, like, yeah, it's practice what we preach abroad, not what we do abroad, because abroad we do horrible human rights violations and sometimes war crimes, and sometimes we support nations, not naming any names, that do war crimes. So like it's nice, it's a good thing to have these reports, but like I really don't think that UN reports are going to change anything, because the UN doesn't change anything. So like we as Americans, and Stephen, should like work on these issues from within, like your like local city council. Like my local city council is a disaster because the NYPD is under the local city council. So like I got a lot of work ahead of me, but it is nice to like have an outside perspective on things. And like they're best nations on like racial discrimination. Like, let's keep it real, are Western countries without a lot of racial disparities in their countries. So like they're like, we have some like disadvantage. Like if you have more different people, you have a better chance of discriminating against them. And there are things like France being discriminatory toward Muslims that kind of fly under the radar in the UN that should be pointed out. And I'm glad Haven pointed that out.
One of the problems that we have, to answer my own question that I posed to you guys at the beginning of the segment, no, I don't think this is going to have an effect. We have a political party that thinks that the UN is literally going to try to force everyone into hobbit homes. And they wield a significant amount of power on Capitol Hill. With those kind of people, those kind of idiots in power, you're not going to see a whole lot of anybody listening to the UN. When Bob Dole, a Republican, right, who's got, I forget what kind of condition he has, but he advocates for a UN treaty to be able to treat disabled people the same, and that gets shot down, you know that there is a problem when it comes to listening to the UN, the most non-controversial treaty ever, and we rejected it. It just seems like we're not going to take anybody else's advice. So I think the change has to come from within, and I think that starts by changing our own perceptions and our own biases and what we think. Like stereotypes, for example. We have a lot of stereotypes of people in America: Muslim Americans, African Americans, Latinos, LGBT people. We need to change the rest of America's mind and to show them that those stereotypes are not true. And I think only then we can actually go and fix some of these rampant issues.
Well, I personally think that some of the stereotypes are true. They come from a true population. I think what we need to learn is that it's okay that these people exist, that these stereotypes exist. We will all get over it because there's bigger fish to fry. I mean, no one's going to really care if black people eat watermelon if your city's underwater. Nobody's going to care if, there's a Mexican guy that's selling fruit on the street if there's a drought in the city. Like, this is a big distraction that gets thrown in our face a lot to help us ignore what is really going to happen to this nation if we don't pull together. And I think the second that happens, when shit starts sinking and people can't turn on their water faucets anymore, that's when people are going to start not having time for this simple crap and start really paying attention.
And I mean, by stereotypes, I want to be clear, the more harmful stereotypes, like the laziness stereotype and, people not working and et cetera, the really harmful stereotypes. Watermelon, look, I don't know anybody who doesn't like watermelon. Let's be honest. Watermelon's delicious.
There are lazy people, though. There are people who abuse the system.
Yeah, of course.
There are, even the most harmful stereotypes, there are people that fit that build. But what I think is that, we focus on that so much that it's irrelevant, because if you look at it, it's not just the worst stereotypes that are suffering from police brutality. This is something that is infecting every neighborhood of every social class except for the top 1%. So it's like...
Oh, totally agree with you. Just the issue that I wanted to make with the stereotypes is that they'll take some of the stereotypes, which are true, for certain amounts of people. I mean, there are always, there will be lazy people, there will be people that take advantage of the system. The problem with that is that some people will take advantage of that and try to paint everybody with that same broad brush.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. But you're right. When his shit starts, hitting the fan, that's a uniter. I mean, people love to get together. And it's one of our best redeeming features is that when the going gets tough, Americans, we put aside our differences and we join hands, we work together, and we get our shit done.